Hi, I hope you're doing well. This is going to be the judge briefing and speaker briefing for Saskatoon WSDC. My name is Jason, and I am one of the chief adjudicators of the tournament. Below in the YouTube description, you're going to see some links to the different time points within the judge and speaker briefing so that you can get to the parts that are most relevant to you. I'm going to cover a number of different things in this briefing. First, I'm going to talk about the format of World Schools debating in terms of the different speakers, their positions, and what they're meant to do. Then, I'm going to talk about the various types of motions that you might encounter and how to engage with those motions. And lastly, I'm going to talk about the individual categories in which World Schools is judged on and also discuss the speaker score range for judges. So, to begin with, in terms of the format of World School style, there are three speakers on both sides of the debate, and each of them will have a main constructive speech. You have a division between the proposition, who has three speakers, and the opposition has three speakers. The order of speeches goes as follows. We start with the first proposition speaker, who speaks for 8 minutes. Then we move on to the first opposition speaker, who speaks for 8 minutes, then the second proposition speaker who speaks for 8 minutes, then the second opposition speaker who speaks for 8 minutes, then the third prop speaker who speaks for 8 minutes, the third opposition speaker who speaks for 8 minutes. At the conclusion of those 6 8-minute speeches from the sides, there will then be reply speeches, which are meant to be summaries of the debate that have occurred. It begins with the opposition reply, which can be delivered by either the first opposition speaker or the second opposition speaker, and that is a 4-minute speech. Then, afterwards, you have the proposition reply speaker, who will give a 4-minute reply as well, and again can be delivered by either the first or second proposition speakers. At the beginning of the round, the speaker should indicate who is going to be giving the reply. So those are basics about the format. In terms of individual speeches, it's also important to note that points of information are allowed. A point of information is a question raised by the other side and which the speaker who is speaking can choose to accept, reject, or take later. The purpose of a point of information is for a member of the other side to interject and raise a point to be able to engage with the debate as it has been occurring. Notably, this does not have to be in the form of a question, although it typically is a question. It can also be a statement. In evaluating points of information, it's just important to note that each speaker should take at least one, ideally two, and each speaker should offer at least two per speech. But I'll talk about the implications of POIs a little bit more in the speaker score range and talk about how you adjudicate a debate more specifically in terms of strategy, content, style. But that's just to flag the different issues at hand. In terms of the individual speeches and the purpose of each speech, I'm going to go over each of them and explain the rules and the purposes. So, the first proposition speaker in any debate is meant to set up definitions and, if applicable, a model. Definitions help to clarify the debate, and a model will oftentimes entail a policy that is being implemented. I'll talk about this a little bit more when I talk about the different types of debates, but for now, you should know that motions that begin with "this House would" or "this House believes that a certain actor should or would do something" are policy motions, and that means that the proposition team should be defining what the policy would look like in the real world. So for instance, in a debate like "this House would legalize prostitution," it would be expected for the first proposition speaker to be able to identify what they mean by legalizing prostitution. For instance, would this be legalizing it for both consumers and providers of sexual services? Alternatively, are there going to be any kinds of fines or any enforcement measures that are going to be placed on this? And will there be any government regulation over prostitution and other sex work? That's a strong example of what a model would potentially look like. After providing that model and the definitions, then the speaker will move into providing typically 2 constructive arguments within that first speech. And in terms of constructive arguments, it just means that these speakers are going to be delivering reasons or claims as to why their side is the correct side, especially given the fact that obviously the proposition supports the motion and the opposition is against the motion. Also within that first speech, you might see some contextualization or characterization of what the world looks like, although that is not strictly necessary or a particularly defined role of a first speaker, and in fact can happen anywhere. That is something that as a first speaker you might want to think about adding, and also might be helpful for clarity to judges and something that they might see often within these first speeches. The first opposition speak, conversely, is meant to challenge the definition or the model if the definition and model are unreasonable. It's important to note that a definition or model being unreasonable includes a definition or model that is outside of the spirit of the debate. So for instance, if you defined this house would legalize prostitution as something about ensuring that labor regulations are lifted broadly speaking, then you would have a definition that we call a squirrel, and therefore you have a proposition team who is interpreting the debate incorrectly, and the opposition has an opportunity to correct that by saying the proposition is interpreting the debate incorrectly and substituting it with a more reasonable definition. Now, of course, there are also other circumstances in which you might get model challenges, but in many circumstances, if the proposition is modeling the debate as the words of the motion indicate are permissible, then there shouldn't be a challenge. So first opposition speakers can challenge a definition. If they do challenge the definition on opposition, it has to happen in the first op speech. But notably enough, you don't necessarily need to challenge a definition. And in fact, in many circumstances, it is wrong to challenge a definition and makes the debate worse. After that definitional challenge, the first opposition speaker is then expected to provide some rebuttal and responses to the first proposition speaker. So explanations as to why the arguments provided by the proposition are incorrect, and then afterwards provide their own 2 constructive arguments on the opposition side. It is notable that the opposition does need to prove a constructive case to some extent, so they can't just win the debate by saying none of proposition's arguments are true. They need to explain why there is a harm or a benefit that occurs from their side of the house, and in motions which are framed as an absolute, they must do so in a significant minority of cases, whereas the proposition needs to prove it in a substantial majority. After the first speeches, you then have the second speeches, which are broadly similar from both sides. In a second speech, you will see further rebuttal of the other team's arguments and reconstruction of the arguments that were provided by the first speaker on either side. So for instance, the second proposition will oftentimes be defending the first proposition's arguments against the rebuttal that came from the first opposition and explain why those arguments are still true. Finally, there should be a new constructive addition within this speech, and there should be a provision of a new argument in most cases. However, the big benchmark is whether or not they constructively add to the debate, so whether or not they add more contributions that provide further positive reasons in favor of their side. That should cover both second speeches as they are relatively similar. The final thing to talk about are the third speeches. And in the third speech, your job is primarily to rebut and reconstruct the arguments that have come out in the debate. Importantly enough, there should be no new arguments coming out from the third speech. Deeper explanations or defenses of previously existing arguments, or the provision of further examples to illustrate the arguments that existed, or even an explanation as to why past arguments mattered in the debate are all acceptable, but there should be no new arguments that are covered. That is to say, there should be no discussion of ideas, constructive ideas that have not been brought up before in the round. If there are new material or new arguments provided in the third speech, judges are entitled to discount that material, not to punish the speaker for having provided that material, but simply to act as if that material had not been provided because it was new and there's no opportunity for the other side to engage with it. This is particularly a higher expectation on the third opposition, given the fact that there is no chance for a response after the third opposition speech. Finally, after all of the main speeches of the debate, you then have the reply speeches. In either reply speech, there's no opportunity for a point of information. So that will be 4 minutes of uninterrupted time where speakers cannot ask questions. And thus, this speech is designed primarily for summary because it isn't about engaging the two sides in the same way, but instead about summarizing the ideas that have come out and providing an explanation as to why the side who is giving the reply speech has won the debate. So again, there should be no new material, and oftentimes these reply speeches will take a more reflective tone to indicate the fact that this is the end of a debate and they're merely summarizing that. Although not taking a reflective tone does not automatically mean that reply speech is bad, given that the content or other areas of that reply speech might be appropriate. The final thing that I want to note in this judge's briefing is just a quick note on POIs. I forgot to mention earlier, but the first and last minute of a speech, a main constructive speech, are protected. And that means that no POIs can be asked in that first or last minute of a main constructive speech. So that is also another protected zone from POIs, as well as the reply speeches from both sides. So that should hopefully cover everything you need to know about the various speeches within the round. And now I'm going to move into discussing how different motions will affect a debate and how it's going to play out. So the first type of motion that's very common is a policy motion. And as I've described before in talking about the various speaker roles, a policy motion requires the proposition to propose a new kind of policy that will be implemented in the world. It's not just abstractly talking about the legalization of prostitution, for instance, to reuse that example, but rather it's to concretely outline what steps a government would take to legalize prostitution and what that world would look like as a consequence. On the opposition, in policy motions, there's the opportunity to counterprop. And a counterprop is just providing an alternative list of things that a government could do instead of the policy implemented by the proposition team or the government team, however you refer to them as. As a consequence, this policy is also going to be useful for the opposition in gaining some ground, but it's important to note that the opposition cannot use more resources than the proposition uses in their model. So for instance, if there is a limitation on the number of funds and the prop argues that they would do something which is abstractly equivalent to something like a few $1,000,000, then the opposition can't impose a requirement on the government to do something that would be significantly more expensive. In debates, you'll rarely see the proposition and opposition quantify their policy in specific resources, but that example is meant to give you a sense of what is generally allowed when counterpropping. So you should only be doing things that require roughly the same amount of resources or less that the proposition is imposing. And this includes things like political resources. So for instance, getting enough voters or MPs on board with the idea, but also physical financial resources. The second category of motions are analysis motions. And typically they will start with things like this house supports or this house believes that. So starting with the idea of motions like this house supports or this house believes that, in these motions, you do not need to define a policy, although you should still be indicating what you think that thing would look like. So for instance, with legalized prostitution, you might still want to describe what some of the hallmark features of a legalized prostitution regulatory regime, what that would look like. In these value debates, you're going to be defending the general idea of something rather than a specific manifestation of the policy. So this house supports prostitution or this house supports legalized prostitution will have a team generally arguing about whether or not prostitution being legal is good or bad. Notably, they have less control in these debates on the proposition side in terms of defining what exactly a legalized prostitution regime would look like. So that debate will have to take place on the most likely version of a legalized prostitution regulatory regime. So for instance, you might say that governments are likely to legalize prostitution in these ways, and that's how you're evaluating it. But you can't just assume that the government will do so in that way. The second type of debate that is relevant are this House regrets debates. And regrets debates are very similar in the sense that they talk about values, but in these debates, it's more important to have a specific counterfactual or comparative. A counterfactual or comparative is just an explanation of what the world would have looked like without a certain thing. So for instance, you might have a motion like this House regrets the rise of slum tourism. And both sides will have to argue what the alternative to slum tourism would have been if that practice did not exist. So for instance, would people who engage in slum tourism then instead engage within the regular tourist industry by going to major cultural or historical sites? So in regrets debates, it's particularly important to define a counterfactual. Another type of motion are motions that are this House prefers. And this House prefers will always go with the formulation of this House prefers X over Y, or this House just prefers this thing. So you could have this House prefers a world in which there are only cats, but you could also have a debate like this House prefers cats over dogs. And there's a subtle distinction between the two. When there are two things which are explicitly being compared in a prefers debate, you have to argue why cats are better than dogs or why dogs are better than cats on the opposition and the proposition. But in a debate that is just this House prefers a world in which there were only cats, you always have to debate the motion, comparing it to the status quo as the world currently is. So for instance, if the motion was something like this House prefers a world in which everyone had superpowers, the opposition cannot stand up and say, well, we prefer a world in which some people had superpowers, because that is not the status quo. The final type of analysis motion to note is this House believes that X should do Y. So this House believes that the West should impose sanctions on Russia. And in that case, you have the flexibility of defining a policy still, but it is notable in these cases that they have the wording of this House believes that X should do Y, because it's to indicate who is exactly performing a certain action, whereas a motion like this House would do whatever, you would just define it as a generic government in the world. So those are all the types of analysis motions which are available. And of course, that final type of analysis motion, which is this House believes that X should do Y, also has a policy element and can have counter props and alternative models coming from the opposition. The final type of motion are actor debates. You might have a motion like this House as Russia would do X, or in fact, within the prepared motions, this House as the EU would provide accession to Turkey in exchange for permanently housing refugees. That's obviously paraphrasing the motion, but that's the kind of structure of a motion. And in these sorts of motions, you need to be explaining why something is desirable from the perspective of the actor that is noted in that debate. So for instance, you need to explain why something is desirable for the EU in the prepared motion. Importantly, in actor debates, there is no limit to the types of interest that may occur. So for instance, you might have a moral interest in doing something because you have a moral obligation. That is perfectly fine, although you do have to explain for any interest why that matters to the actor at hand. Generally speaking, as an adjudication core, we'd also like to emphasize that you can make principled arguments. You don't have to just make arguments about consequences or about utilitarianism, so long as you can explain why it is that a principle matters and is significant for the debate. But in theory, you should be able to make principled arguments, and judges should not be discounting principled arguments automatically, but instead discount them on whether or not they've been rebutted or their quality. Great. So that is the discussion of different types of motions and generally how you might approach different motions, as well as a brief discussion at the very end about principles and their validity. The final thing that I want to talk about is in terms of the scoring range and in terms of the various areas in which you're going to be evaluating a debater. And this is primarily going to be something for the judges to listen to So if you're a speaker, this is not going to be the most important part of this briefing. So there are three different categories in World Schools debate. The first category is content. And what content evaluates are the arguments that are being provided and the quality of analysis. It's often said that you should think about what you would do if you were marking an essay. So for instance, you're just looking at the quality of arguments as they're written down or as they would be communicated through any format without any of the rhetorical flourishes that you might get from style or any of the decisions about what you want to talk about as you might get in strategy. So content is just concerned with the level of analysis, the quality of examples, etc. The second category in World Schools debating is style. And in style, you start to evaluate everything, including gestures, tonal modulation, speed and pace, types of rhetorical language that are used, etc. So this is where you're oftentimes going to get a facilitation of things like emotive language, humorous debaters, etc., and you evaluate speakers on that basis. It's also important to note that a very basic thing about style that is necessary for debating is clarity. If you don't have clarity, then it's difficult to credit arguments, but that's also bad independently within the style category of marking. The final category is strategy. And strategy essentially refers to what you end up spending your time on and what you focus on. So if you know what the important issues of a debate are, then you have good strategy because you've indicated this through what you're choosing to respond to and how much time you're spending on all these different things. Strategy is not concerned about the quality of responses, so whether or not they prove the thing that they set out to prove, but rather is about an understanding of what is important in the debate based on the wording and how the debate has evolved throughout the round. So in each of these categories, the technical scale is from 0 to 40, but actually in content and style, you're going to have a scale of 24 to 32. And within the within the strategy marker, you're going to have a score between 12 and 16. And the reason why is because the broad range of scores within World Schools are going to be between 60 and 80. That is a hard cap. Although typically you will see scores between 65 and 75. This is done by adding up all of the different categories that exist on a ballot. So for instance, if you have the minimum score in each category, 24 in content, 24 in style, and 12 in strategy, that will lead to a total score of 60. Whereas if you have the maximum scores in each category, you're going to have a score of 80. We'd encourage you to use marking of each individual section, but obviously holistic marking is okay, especially if you're more experienced and don't need the guideline of the individual sections. Finally, as a note for judges who haven't judged in a while, World Schools debating has had its range expand in recent years, so higher scores are now more acceptable. As a reference point, the top speaker at World Schools 2018 averaged about a 75 overall. So it is completely possible that you will have higher scores than you might have previously expected if you were a debater or judge in previous years of World Schools, although it is notable that you aren't going to see many scores above 75, and that is quite rare. Okay, excellent. So that covers all the stuff about the scoring range and about the individual sections and how you're going to be evaluating the debates as a whole. As a final note for judges, I'd like to point out that we ideally want all the ballots within 15 minutes after the round concludes to ensure that we can run to schedule. And afterwards, you can still have a brief chat with the rest of the judges before someone delivers a RFD. Typically, a RFD, which is the reason for decision, will be delivered by the chair judge, and we will designate who the chair judge is. Although in some circumstances, if the chair judge's decision as to who won the debate is not followed by the rest of the panel and they are outvoted, a member of the majority, who is not the chair, may also wish to deliver that RFD. However, before all of that, we'd really like you to finish the ballots within 15 minutes so that we can stay to time for the tournament. Finally, I'm going to be attaching different resources to the PowerPoint where you can look at some of the things that I've talked about today. So I'll try and attach the rules of WSDC debating and also the rules of WUDC debating only for the section on types of motions within the latter document, given that it isn't actually World Schools debating. However, the different types of motions that are used in debating are referenced in the WUDC style guide, and therefore that section will still be relevant and useful for your reference. Thanks so much for judging. If you have any questions, please feel free to email the Saskatoon WSDC email account.